Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. In this video, we are going to see how to break an application's authentication logic and gain complete control of other organization by exploiting a simple flaw. So let's get started. Before proceeding any further, let me give you a brief about application authentication flow. Whenever a user enters their credential on login page, it calls in post request to login endpoint carrying the username and the password in the body, and server validates it, assigning you some temporary identifiers which you are going to use further to access it. This is a pretty normal flow which you might have already seen for any other application, but in this case, application was providing multiple identifiers to user like PHP session ID, organization ID, another session ID and a user ID. So what are these identifiers and how they are being used in the application for the authentication and authorization? So let's dig deep into these identifier, each of them one by one. So starting off with PHP session ID, you might have already seen this in a lot of PHP based application where this session ID is always there. It basically authenticates you, but it does not authorize you. Many times it is validated on reverse proxy or middleware level. So it will tell that, okay, you are a valid user to the application, but it can't tell that what features or what access you have been provided into the application. Next, we have SID. This was responsible for authorization and access, but this is a temporary session identifiers equivalent to PHP session ID, which is also a temporary session identifier. But yeah, based on this SID, you can tell a user has access to certain privilege or features or API endpoints. Then we have another identifier, which was UUID. This was also being sent in each and every post request, and this is also responsible for authorization and access check, but this is a permanent identifier. So even though you logged out and you log in again, the value of this UUID will never going to change for a user. I've also observed that not every request had the requirement of this UUID. So even if you remove it from the request, you will see that still the server is accepting the request, and that is probably because of the session ID, because it also tells that what user you are and what privilege you have. Then we had another parameter in the body of each request, which was T3. Upon further digging deep into this parameter value, I found that this is basically representing the organization of the user. So an application could have multiple organization, and based on that, a user is allowed to access which organization. That is something you can tell with this particular parameter value. And this is again a permanent identifier. So for an organization, this is never going to change. And all the users inside that organization, all of them will have same parameter value. So these were all four parameters which basically use for authorization and authentication of a user. Now you can tell this is already a pretty much complex scenario where multiple parameters and values are being used to authorize the request or any operation. Now upon digging deep, I found an integration page where I saw that this application is providing a REST API integration feature. This way, an user can basically integrate this application features into their custom tools or build some custom CI/CD things where they can directly use this API, and they don't need to log in every time whenever they want to use this API, because they will simply provide some kind of access token or client ID and client secret which you can use to generate an access token and further authenticate any API call. When I saw that REST API v3 is something new, I immediately knew that there could be flaw in the authentication, and I found that one authentication issue which I will going to later discuss in this slide. So how this API v3 authentication flow was working. So suppose this was the post request, Ajax admin REST API v3 controller.php. The host is, let's say, target.com, and obviously the cookie will be PHP session ID. This was required again. You cannot remove it because the reverse proxy or middleware immediately throws a different kind of error which you will be able to simply know that, okay, this is a reverse proxy, or this is a application server, or this is coming from microservices, right? Then we had T3 organization ID, which again is important in every request, and this request also, it was important to tell the server, okay, for which user you want to, for which organization you want to generate the access token or client ID or client secret. Then we have session ID. This validates the user session, and the UUID, again the fourth parameter which is required in this particular request. Now finally we have a request parameter, and this was something suspicious to me because a request carrying another request inside is always a pretty much complex thing, and developers should be really careful while building this kind of architecture. So this was carrying a base 64 encoded data, and as soon as I saw that this was an encoded form, I knew that okay, this directly does not being used at the particular application server but could be used in a different server, and that is why it is being sent in a base 64 encoded form, because the application would want the same data to transfer over another server and they don't need to worry about like scaping or indentation errors, right? So parsing won't be an issue just because it's in base 64 encoded and you can simply send it to in any body or any request, right? Upon decoding this data, I saw that there has multiple things in that JSON body. So it was a JSON body where it was carrying scope, which pretty much clears that okay, the client ID or client secret which you want to generate, what kind of permission you want to give. And then it was carrying the T3 account ID and action equals create. So action equals to create immediately told me that this could be a microservices or a different server where it is solely responsible for just to create the client ID and client secret. But then again I saw that it is again carrying a T3 ACCT ID. So ACCT could be account and ID is simply an ID identifier. But T3 immediately told me that it is something related to organization, because we have previously seen that T3 is an organization ID. It was not exactly the same value, but yeah, for an organization it was always constant. So if something is constant for an organization, it directly identifies that organization. You can tell by that. And in the response, the user was getting client ID and client secret, which you can later on use to generate the access token. Let's see in detail that how this actually happening in terms of interaction with the microservice. So first let's look at the request. So this was the request. You see, this is base 64 encoded. So the session I was using was an staging account, and again when I saw that T3 ACCT ID, the value was for n staging account, and I immediately saw that okay, this is confusion already, because the request here already carrying one organization ID and another request which will further be generated at the server level for any other controller or microservice where the client ID or client secret will be generated. That T3 ACCT ID is being used from here. So now we knew that an attacker can clearly create a confusion. You can simply create a confusion by showing this T3 ID to some other organization or showing this T3 ID to other organization. When I tried changing this particular T3 ID, the organization ID, I immediately see on 401 unauthorized or 403 forbidden error from the server, which is general behavior of throughout the application for that pen test, but it was something which was being mapped with the PHP session ID or maybe session ID, SID. So that is why you cannot directly modify this one, because at the root level of the server, it is matching whether this organization ID is valid for this session or this user or not. But then what about this T3 ACCT ID? So let's see how we can do and exploit this particular scenario. So as I told you, this particular server, application server, is again calling another controller or microservice where it is sending the same data in the request, but it tells that for which organization you have to create an access client ID or the client secret and what kind of scope you want for that particular client ID and client secret. So that's what a simple flow was, and I knew that if this is the case, then there could be chance that this server is not actually checking whether this T3 ACCT ID is belonging to this user or not, because at this level it was checking pretty much, and the authorization was robust here. But there could be chances that the microservice or the controller which is responsible for generating this client ID and client secret, they could not be checking, right? So what I did was I swapped this T3 ACCT ID with the victim organization ID, but keeping the original T3 ACTV ID of my organization only. So the flow will be something like that. When server will get that request, it will check, okay, this organization ID is belonging to this user, and it will allow the microservice or the controller to go for the generation of client ID and client secret. But in that, it does not validate whether this victim organization ID is belonging to this user. So that's what I did, and you can see this request where I modified it with the another account. This was a pentest account, different organization, keeping everything of mine only, the PHP session, the request, the T3 ID, the session ID, and the UUID. All of this was mine user's account or organization, but the T3 ACCT ID, which was for a different organization, and it worked. So the generation was done for the pentest account, not for the staging account, and this told me that maybe I can use this client ID and client secret to generate the access token, because upon decoding this request, you see that this T3 ACCT ID is for pentest account and the session is for staging account. Now let's see if generation of session token was successful or not, and it was indeed. I used the same client ID and client secret and used the victim T3 ACCT ID, and it gave me the bearer token. And upon validation, I found that this is directly giving the whole control of the victim organization. So this was a pretty standard flow where you see that an broken access control cannot be always at the same level, but you have to try at the multiple level of the application architecture. Now, how a developer should fix this issue or keep an eye that this kind of flaw can occur if you are dealing with a multi-level architecture of an application? You simply, whenever the request body is being coming with this particular base64 encoded data, you simply decode at this particular level only, the application level, where it first checks for all those authorization and access, and match whether this particular victim organization ID is actually belonging to this user or not. If not, then immediately throw that invalid organization ID, and it should not proceed further for generation of client ID and client secret. So this will simply fix this issue. So thank you for staying with me in this video, and see you in another video.